My friends, given the fact that I was ordained at the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York City, it is not often that here in Los Angeles I'm actually afforded the opportunity to share the Bima with one of my teachers. However, today it's slightly different. Today I get to share the Bima with Dr. Daivd Kraemer, who was my teacher back at the Jewish Theological Seminary over 20 years ago. At that time, my class with him, as it was for my other classmates, was brilliant, exciting, challenging, and in it, we were able to delve not only into the rabbinic text that Dr. Kraemer teaches and teaches so well and is so passionate about, but able to also carry those texts forward and apply the things we were studying to the conservative movement and to American Jewish life around us. In his official capacity, Dr. Kraemer is the Joseph J. and Dora Abel Librarian and Professor of Talmud of Rabbinics at the Jewish Theological Seminary. In his scholarship, Dr. Kraemer is particularly interested in the literary analysis of rabbinic literature, rabbinic ritual, and the social and religious history of Jews in late antiquity. And most importantly, at least for today, he is also Carly's uncle. It is a pleasure to be able to share the Bima with him this morning.
20 years, wow. I was going to say, I could have sworn it was no more than 5. What a lot of simcha today. We could have used candies with yo-yo strings, right? Would have actually made it a lot easier. And who would have known that this occasion for so many simchas is also an occasion for a lot of comment on the Torah. So as we were sitting and listening to the multiple rabbinic comments, my family was sitting next to me and saying, "Was that what you were going to say? Was that what you were going to say? Do you still have something you could say?" The tribute to the Torah, the tribute to the richness of the Torah, is the fact that despite the fact that we've already learned a lot about today's Torah portion, there's a lot more to say, and I still have every word to say that I was prepared to say in the beginning. So, again, a tribute to the Torah. I remember when my brother Sam called me a few months ago and offered me the honor of speaking here now, and told me what the parsha was, Ki Tisa, and I was all excited, not only because of the honor, but because I actually agree with what one of the rabbis said earlier, that is, not that it's my favorite parsha. My father had a tradition of speaking of his favorite child, his favorite grandchild, but every single one of them was his favorite in their own unique way. So in that way, this is my favorite parsha. But more importantly, actually, whatever my favorite parsha might be, I do really think that this is the most important parsha in the Torah. It's not central literally, but it is central in a way that I think cannot be exaggerated, because in its long narrative, which has been referenced several times, it makes a crucially important point. That is, that Israel can sin. We can sin. We can sin grievously. We can betray God. And then Moses comes to God and literally seduces God. If you look at the text following the golden calf, you'll find that Moses is literally involved in a seduction of God. Seduces God into agreeing that despite our flaws, we can still be in intimate relationship. If God required perfection, then we would have failed from the very beginning. If, on the other hand, God was willing to settle for a relationship that was built even on the flaws, then we could continue as we have to this day. I can't think of any more important, any more fundamental message than that. The problem is that as I sat down in Laguna Beach by poolside with Carly in December to review what was being read, what you were reading today, there wasn't a word in the Torah reading about what I just described. Because you read only part of the Torah reading, of the Shabbat reading, and the part that is so crucially important is actually not what was read this morning. You may have noticed that. So I wanted to take the challenge and come to the part that was being read, and lo and behold, I found what may not be the most important long section in the Torah, but it's crucially important nevertheless. It's been mentioned earlier. That is the fact that as the census is being taken, the requirement for the census, in the midst of that, there's a requirement for a payment. And the payment is to atone for the souls of those who are being counted, to atone for the souls of Israel. Now, why, on account of a census, you would require atonement, I have no idea. It's a great mystery, and it's actually not central to the point I want to make. What's crucial is that whatever the explanation of that mystery is, there's a very interesting thing said here, and that is, I'm reading from the beginning of the Parsha, verses 14 and 15. Everyone who is entered in the records from the age of 20 years up shall give the Lord's offering. The rich shall not pay more, and the poor shall not pay less than half a shekel when giving the Lord's offering as an expiation for your persons or for your souls. And then it goes on to indicate that the money that's collected this way should be used for the service of the tabernacle, of the tent of meeting. Now, any of you who have been involved in boards of synagogues or other organizations know that it's a terrible fundraising strategy to say everyone should give exactly the same small amount. You're not going to be able to support a synagogue service, a sanctuary service that way. And so this is actually a very puzzling piece. Why in the world would it demand exactly the same amount regardless of whether you are wealthy or poor? The answer has been suggested before, but it's important to reemphasize. I think it's clear. The statement being made here is that however we relate to one another in God's view, and these are offerings being made fully and directly in God's view at the tabernacle, every single one of our souls is worth exactly the same amount. There is no greater amongst us, and there is no lesser. Now, it might seem striking that such a statement would be made in the midst of a section of the Torah that seems to be all about hierarchy. We are, after all, talking about tabernacle and sacrifice. We all know that there are priests and there are Levites and there is Israel. There are all kinds of divisions, higher and lower hierarchy that are assumed in the course of this section. So how do we reconcile this fundamental equality declared in this verse with what seems to be said in the rest of the long part of the Torah that talks about the tabernacle and insists upon this hierarchy? The answer I want to suggest is that we, that is to say Israel, when we are represented before God, we are the ones who need hierarchy. We need those who can stand up above, before us, before God, because there's something in us that requires those distinctions. But God does not insist on those distinctions. Before God, we're all equal. I want to offer a parallel to this in order to build the case. Earlier this week, I was studying Mishnah. Mishnah is the earliest work of rabbinic law, with my mother. And we learned something very interesting. The rabbis in the Mishnah, now the arena is changed. We're no longer talking about the tabernacle. We've been transformed. We've been, moved to the court. And the question is, what happens in the court? Who can judge and who can be judged? Who can be the witness and who can offer testimony, have testimony offered against them? And there's a very interesting distinction that the rabbis make in the Mishnah. They say that the priest can judge and be judged, can be a witness, and can have testimony offered against him, but the king of Israel cannot be judged in this court, nor be judged, cannot be a witness, and cannot have testimony offered against him. Now, that's a very interesting distinction. The king, no, and the priest, yes. Now, in order to understand this, I think we need to understand that for the rabbis, the center of the encounter with God is the place of justice, the court. Unlike for the priests, where the center of the encounter with God, of course, is the tabernacle or the temple. So when the rabbis bring us to the court, they're saying the office that represents you, Israel, that is to say the king, there we will accept hierarchy. There will be differences. But when you stand in justice before God, there are no differences. Everyone is the same. Priest and Levite and common Israelite will be judged on exactly the same standards. The difference then, I think, is God's view and our view. What God requires or admits and what we require. It's interesting if you think about it. More than 200 years ago, we Americans rebelled against the Brits. We threw them out. We said, we don't care about your king. We don't care about your royalty. We don't care about your lords and ladies. And yet, how many of you watch Downton Abbey and are all tantalized by, right, the lords and the ladies and the rest? How many of you get up outrageously early to watch royal weddings, to hear news of royal births and things like that? There is something about the human animal that needs this kind of hierarchy. But God offers an aspiration, or maybe stated a little bit differently, the God's eye view offers an aspiration. On the one hand, Judaism, the rabbis have always said, you know what, we've got to settle for what humanity has. We can't insist upon perfection, because if we insist upon perfection, we're bound to fail. That's on the one hand. So there will be hierarchies. There will be those who are above and those who are below. But the God's eye view is the aspirational view. It says, whoever we are as a species, whatever our societies may be, with their vast differences, we can aspire to something different, and we might make the moves to get just a little bit closer. So if the God's eye view is the one where each and every one of us is exactly the same, our souls are worth exactly the same, then our aspiration ought to be that whosever presence we are in, whether it be our local royalty, our celebrities, or whether it be the beggars or the homeless on the street, the soul of one is like the soul of the other. And in our aspiration, we can come closer to God's view and say we will treat all of us with the same dignity, the same respect, and that will bring us closer to what God demands of us. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.